An advanced shipping notice, or ASN, is used to notify a company that a delivery is on the way. ASNs are a common EDI document, and nowadays most ERP systems support their use. ASNs enable a sender to describe the contents and configuration of a shipment, as well as convey additional information about the shipment, such as the items for the orders that it includes, the type of packaging that it is including, and so on. In the current version of Dynamics AX, we have the ability to receive ASNs from vendors, store the shipment information, and then use the information to make receiving processes more efficient. Receiving an ASN is currently only available for products and warehouses that are enabled for advanced warehouse management processes, the so-called WHS items and warehouses. Here, we will walk through an example of receiving an advanced shipping note and will review the components in play that enable this functionality. A vendor typically sends an ASN in relation to a shipment about to be dispatched, so as to let our warehouse know when and what is arriving, allowing us to prepare for it. Therefore, it's only logical a purchase order must be registered in the system against this vendor before we can receive an ASN. The purchase order number must be communicated to the vendor when the purchase order is confirmed. The vendor in turn will include this purchase order number in the ASN, allowing us to match the details of the shipment against a specific order. To support the walkthrough in this example, I have created the purchase orders shown in the slide. As you can see, there are two purchase orders, 100 each of item A0001 to warehouse 24, 600 each of this item to warehouse 24 on a different purchase order, and then 300 additional items of a batch controlled item P0004. Just to show the same setup in AX, here we can see the first purchase order for 100 each of A001 and then the second purchase order for the corresponding quantities of the different items. In Dynamics AX 2012 R3, the Inbound ASN was implemented as a standard AXD document, relying on the Application Integration Framework, or AAF for short, for processing. In the current version of Dynamics AX, AAF is obsolete and has been replaced with data entities. As such, the Inbound ASN is now implemented as a composite data entity. Just to give a quick refresher on the concepts behind data entities provide conceptual abstraction and encapsulation of underlying table schemas to represent key data concepts and functionalities. A composite data entity allows you to build a single entity by leveraging multiple child entities that are related to each other. The concept is heavily used in scenarios where an entity can be represented as a single document. For example, a sales order would be represented as a composite entity with sales order header and sales order lines as child entities for the simple case. It is only supported as part of asynchronous integration scenarios, as part of XML file-based imports and exports. So OData synchronous scenarios do not support composite data entities. But you can read a much more detailed description of these concepts by following the wiki links provided below in the useful links section. And here on this slide you can see the composite entity and the related child entity definitions in AX for the Inbound ASN. If you are familiar with the design of the Inbound ASN in the AX 2012 R3, you will notice that there are a few extra components now present, namely the inbound load header and inbound shipment header. With this addition, the vendor can now include additional information as part of the ASN, describing in more detail when and how the goods are expected to arrive, not just what the goods are and how they are packed. Import and export of data entities is done through the Data Management Workspace. You can use it to browse the definitions for entities, modify entity target mapping setup, configure supported source data formats, manually import or export data or configure an automatic recurring job for it. In addition, this is the place you would look to review the history of import and export operations. All data entities are defined through the Application Explorer in Microsoft Visual Studio. Composite entities are defined solely by the metadata, more specifically by a hierarchy of entities related to each other in some way. As you can see, for the Inbound ASN entity, we have a number of child entities under it that are related to each other through the relations specified in the properties. In order to handle the case where a palette comes with one or more cases on it, we've added two additional entities for case line and case line entity. Because they are very similar to the regular packing structure entity and the packing structure line entity, they share their code through a table map called Inbound Load Packing Structure Line Mapping. While the composite data entity is metadata only, the individual child entities have code behind. For example, we can open up and take a look at the code for the packing structure entity. You can see there is some logic or business logic that is implemented here. As with other data entities, the structure of an inbound ASN file is relatively simple, so you should have no problems creating ASNs of your own. You can also use the sample here as an example. This XML document corresponds to the two purchase orders we created earlier, which are traveling to our warehouse as part of the same load. You can now specify additional properties to be set on the load that gets created in AX when importing the inbound ASN. Some useful examples might be transportation-related fields, delivery information, etc. In here, I just used a random field tractor number. As for the packing structure of the load, the vendor decided to put the entire quantity for the first order on a pallet with license plate ID LPASN001. Since there was more room on the pallet, he also put some of the quantity for the second order on it, including additional quantity of the same item, as well as a batch tracked item where you can see we specify the batch number here. The remainder, which did not fit on the first pallet, was put on a second pallet, LPASN002, and for the sake of making the example more extensive, it was put in a case, LPASN002CO1. Importing a data entity manually is a straightforward process, and the inbound ASN composite entity is no exception. You kick off the import from the data management workspace by clicking on the import tile button and following the below steps. First, we need to enter a name for the import job. Let's say it is inbound ASN manual. Then we need to select a source data format. For composite entities, it needs to be either XML attribute or XML element, since a hierarchical structure needs to be represented. In our case, it is a XML attribute. Select the name of the entity you are importing, and this is needed so that it can be mapped to the source file. And then click the upload button and select the source file to import. And that's the same file that I've shown just before. The source file will at this point be parsed, and all of the fields in the file will be mapped to the corresponding entity representation. You can see we got some information messages saying that the mapping has been done successfully. We can actually look at the map for each of the entities. For example, for this part of the file, the inbound load packing structure, we can see we've only mapped one field, which is the license plate number. But there are more fields that are available in the staging table, meaning the file could have contained additional fields that we could map. Yes. You can now go and manually modify these mappings if necessary, or add some additional ones if they were not mapped correctly. For example, if the file contained different names or different format of these fields. Now you can import the file by clicking on the import button on the toolbar, which will kick off an asynchronous import operation for the selected file and mapping definitions. Alternatively, and this is what I'm going to use, you can click on import options and select import now, which will start the import right away. Let's give it a few seconds. When the import of the file is completed, you'll be presented with a summary of what happened and the overall result, including the number of records that were imported into each of the child entities that you can see here on the right. For each of the tables, we see the number of records, the total for the composite entity being 11 records. We can see the execution status was a success, and we can view the staging data that was imported for each of the child entities accordingly if we want to. So for example, here we can see that it was the tractor number, and the load number was auto-generated based on the mapping definition that we have done. Now, in case of failures, of course, you could use this to correct any of the mistakes and then try to recommit the unprocessed records by clicking on the copy data to target button. As a result of importing the ASN, you can now see that we have a new load that was created, is in status open, has the tractor number that we specified in the file, and has 3 lines corresponding to the 3 purchase order lines that we created originally, and 2 shipments accordingly, as you can see, 11 and 12. The packing structure also represents the data that was put in the file. As you can see, we have 2 license plates, one that has items from 2 different shipments on it, and the other one with items from just 1 shipment, but which has packs or cases as they're called. You can see this one has 2 multiple items, and in AX7 we've actually fixed up a number of these summary fields so that now they actually represent the correct data from the lines. You can see this item also has the batch number information, which was created along with the rest of the data. So the next step would be to now when the goods actually arrive at the warehouse, use the license plate receiving mobile device menu item to receive both of these license plates. But this has not changed since X2012 R3, so you can just refer to the information we've already posted about the license plate receiving in general on our blog and the wiki site. We can also configure the import job to be recurring, which is what most people are probably going to use in their production environments, where they receive multiple ASN documents from vendors throughout the day and want to automatically import them into the system, avoiding any user interaction apart from error handling at the end of the day. The job needs to be based on an XML file, similar to the one you'd use when importing some specific data, because there are 3 possible configurations the files can have: only packing structure lines, only packing structure case lines, and both at the same time, like in our example above. The file used for mapping needs to be a superset of all 3 combinations. In order to add ASN files to be imported, we will use REST APIs available in the current version of Dynamics AX through the corresponding service endpoint. In order to do that, we'll need the process sending in the files to be able to communicate with the Dynamics AX services, and for that, they must be registered in Azure Active Directory as a native client application, which allows authentication via a username and password. The endpoint supports standard OAuth 2.0 authentication. A walkthrough of creating a native client application is provided through one of the links in the Useful Links section. Note that this will only need to be done once by the Azure Portal administrator. Here I just wanted to share a sample mapping file um, which you can use specifically for configuring the periodic import. If you look at it closely, you'll see that it looks more or less the same as the file from our previous example, but just a little simpler. In order to create a recurring data job, you need to follow more or less the same steps as for manual import of a file. Click on the import tile, enter a name for the job. Let's call it Inbound ASN recurring. Select the source data format. It's the same XML attribute. Type in the name of the entity. For us it's the Inbound ASN. And now upload a file which was going to be used only for mapping purposes, which is why I'm selecting this mapping file, the special mapping file that I've just showed you before. Once we confirm that the mapping is successful and there are no errors, we can move on and click on the Create Recurring Data Job button. This will open a new dialog. For creating a recurring data job, we need to enter a name for it. Let's call it Recurring Job ASN. Enter an optional description. And now we need to take note of this ID of this job, because we will actually use it later when enqueuing messages for import of the ASN. We also need to enter the authorization policy details here, the native application ID from Azure Active Directory, which we will use to authenticate and get permission for dynamic connector APIs in order to be able to import files. One note of the advanced options is that apart from the file option, which we're gonna use in this example, there is also a more advanced data package file, data package option, which you can read more about in the wiki site. Now we need to click on the Set Processing Recurrence button to select how frequently we're going to poll the queue, and let's say it is every 10 minutes. Now let's make it every 5 minutes. Confirm that. Copy the ID of the job as I mentioned before, and now click OK. It will ask if we want to also enable the job now, and let's say yes, because we want to have it running. Now we can see that a new data project was created for the recurring data job, and we can move on to the next step, actually sending files. In order to now place one or more ASN files into the processing queue, we need to use the REST and Queue API. I have provided a link to download a sample application from GitHub, which has the code that showcases how this can be done. I will now use this project from GitHub to enqueue an ASN file, process it, and review the data that was created. After you have downloaded and compiled the project, you need to open up the application to see the UI similar to what you see on the screen. You will need to enter the client-side settings, the server settings, and the data transfer settings. For the client-side settings, there are 4 folders that we use in the example for handling the files. The most important one being the input location, where we will place the ASN file to be imported. The server settings is the authentication mechanism, which is the URL for AX, the username and password, the authentication endpoint for authorization, and the Azure Active Directory tenant, as well as the GUID, the native client application ID, which I mentioned earlier. The data transfer settings, the most important one is the activity ID, which is the ID of the recurring data job that we created before. The entity name has to be the actual label of the entity, so in our case it's the Inbound ASN, and we are going to import the data into the USMF company. We can now start the execution, and the application will wait for files being placed in the input folder. We do that by clicking the Start button. We will take the Inbound ASN initial mapping file, which we have set up data for in the system, and I'll not show it just to save time, and place it in the input folder that we have set up in the settings of the application.
It will immediately be picked up for processing. As we can see, the counters have increased, and the file has been enqueued and is now awaiting, the application is now awaiting the job status. Don't forget to enable the Microsoft Dynamics AX batch management service, as this is what drives the execution of the queue. Since I have scheduled the recurrence to be every 5 minutes, we can actually take the time and explore some of the management or troubleshooting options while we wait for the job to execute. As you can see, the application itself is providing clear information in the logs about the activities that happened, which is nice for troubleshooting purposes when we are just playing around with the application and the REST APIs. But we also have some useful forms built into the application itself. If we go and load the project for the recurring import, click on Manage and select Manage Recurrent Data Jobs, we will see all the data jobs that are currently running. And we can look at the Manage Messages form, which will show all of the jobs that have been sent, or messages, I guess is the proper term here, that have been sent in, and you can see the current status is queued. So we are still waiting for it to execute. We need another couple minutes for that. So after the elapsed time, we can see that the job has now completed successfully. The counter for the successful jobs has updated to 1. And if we look at the messages now for the recurrent data job, we can see that it was processed, and we can now look at the execution details and see that we have imported 7 records in total, and the result was a success. We can also see the same information if we just go to the data management workspace. We will see it in the job history for the recurring job of the ASN with exactly the same execution details.
As you can see, importing an inbound ASN has become even simpler with the release of the latest version of AX, thanks to the flexibility and stability provided by the data entities and the data import and export framework. If you have additional questions, start by looking through the links provided in the Useful Links section, and reach out to us if your question is not answered there. Thank you.